If the title touched your heart, just imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Madison estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors where 8-year-old Charlotte played with her favorite teddy bear. Her small fingers traced the worn fabric as she listened to the familiar sound of heels clicking against the floor above. Victoria was awake, and that meant trouble was coming. Charlotte's father, CEO Jonathan Madison, had already left for his downtown office in his black Mercedes, his usual goodbye kiss still warm on her forehead. At 42, Jonathan commanded respect in boardrooms across America, building his empire from a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth billions. But at home, he was simply daddy to a little girl who missed her real mommy more than she could express in words. The Madison estate sprawled across 5 acres of pristine Connecticut countryside, with manicured gardens, a tennis court, and enough rooms to house a small army. Yet despite all its grandeur, Charlotte often felt like a prisoner in her own home, especially when Victoria was prowling the halls with her calculating green eyes and cruel smile. "Charlotte, come here this instant!" Victoria's sharp voice echoed down the hallway, cutting through the peaceful morning like a knife through silk. At 33, Victoria Madison was everything Charlotte's late mother hadn't been: cold, calculating, and obsessed with money. Her perfectly manicured nails and designer clothes couldn't hide the cruelty that lurked beneath her beautiful exterior. The little girl reluctantly made her way to the study, her small feet barely making a sound on the expensive Persian rugs that cost more than most people's cars. The hallway was lined with family portraits, but Victoria had systematically removed every picture that showed Charlotte's biological mother, replacing them with professional photographs of herself and Jonathan at various charity galas and business events. Victoria stood beside Daddy's massive oak desk, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the morning light as she rifled through papers with practiced efficiency. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, paired with designer pants that emphasized her tall, elegant frame. Everything about Victoria screamed expensive perfection, from her flawless makeup to her Italian leather shoes. "Did you touch anything in here yesterday?" Victoria demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her wedding ring, a 15-carat diamond that should have belonged to Charlotte's real mother, glinted as she gestured accusingly toward the child. The ring had been her mother's engagement ring, but Victoria had claimed it as her own, saying it would be wasteful to let such an expensive piece of jewelry sit unused. "No, ma'am," Charlotte whispered, clutching her teddy bear tighter against her small chest. She had learned to call Victoria ma'am after too many punishments for using her first name. The word tasted bitter on her young tongue, a constant reminder that she was considered a subordinate in her own home rather than a beloved daughter. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she continued searching through the desk drawers with increasing agitation. Her movements were precise and methodical, like a predator hunting for prey. "I know you've been sneaking around, you little brat. Children your age should be seen and not heard, and definitely not poking their noses where they don't belong." Her fingers paused on a particular document, and Charlotte noticed how her stepmother's breathing quickened with excitement. Victoria's pupils dilated slightly as she read whatever was written on the paper, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across her lips, the same expression she wore when she successfully convinced Jonathan that Charlotte was lying about something. "I was just playing with Mr. Buttons," Charlotte said softly, holding up her teddy bear as evidence of her innocence. The toy had been a gift from her biological mother before the car accident 3 years ago, one of the few things Victoria hadn't managed to throw away or accidentally damage. The bear's fur was matted from years of love and tears, and one of his button eyes hung loose, but he remained Charlotte's most treasured possession. "Playing," Victoria scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain as she moved toward the large painting that hung behind Jonathan's desk. The oil painting depicted a serene landscape of rolling hills and a peaceful lake, painted by Charlotte's grandmother decades earlier. It was one of the few family heirlooms that Victoria hadn't sold or donated to charity. "Your father spoils you rotten with all these toys and games. If it were up to me, you'd be in boarding school where you belong, learning some discipline and proper behavior." Charlotte's heart sank at the familiar threat that had haunted her dreams for months. Victoria mentioned boarding school whenever Daddy wasn't around, painting terrifying pictures of lonely dormitories filled with mean children, strict teachers who wouldn't tolerate a difficult child like Charlotte, and cold, empty rooms where she would cry herself to sleep every night. The little girl often wondered if Victoria would actually send her away permanently, leaving her with no family at all. "Can I go play outside in the garden?" Charlotte asked quietly, hoping to escape before Victoria's mood turned even darker. The garden was her safe space where she could pretend her real mommy was still alive and watching over her from heaven. She had a special spot under the old oak tree, where she would have tea parties with Mr. Buttons and tell him stories about the mother she barely remembered. "Not until I'm finished here," Victoria snapped, her attention focused entirely on something behind the painting. Charlotte watched in growing confusion as her stepmother's fingers traced the edges of the ornate frame with the familiarity of someone who had done this many times before. There was something secretive about her movements, something that made Charlotte's stomach twist with anxiety. She heard a soft click, followed by the whisper of metal against metal. Victoria had found something hidden behind the painting, something that made her smile in a way that sent chills down Charlotte's spine. The little girl had never seen that particular expression on her stepmother's face before. Pure, undisguised greed mixed with triumphant satisfaction. Victoria pulled out a small black device that looked like the tablets Daddy used for work and began pressing buttons with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Charlotte didn't understand what she was seeing, but every instinct in her young body screamed that something was terribly wrong. Daddy had always told her that his study was private, that certain things were meant only for grown-ups who understood important business matters. "Victoria?" Charlotte's small voice trembled with uncertainty, barely above a whisper. "What are you doing with Daddy's special place behind the painting?" Her stepmother spun around so quickly that Charlotte stumbled backward, nearly dropping Mr. Buttons in her surprise. Victoria's face had transformed from focused concentration to pure, unbridled fury. Her green eyes blazed with an anger that seemed far too intense for such a simple question from a confused child. "You didn't see anything. You understand me?" Victoria hissed, advancing on the frightened child like a predator stalking its prey. Her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that made Charlotte's blood run cold. "And if you even think about telling your father what you saw here, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable little life." Charlotte nodded frantically, tears beginning to form in her brown eyes, as Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers gripped her small shoulders painfully tight. She had heard variations of this threat before, usually delivered in whispered conversations when Jonathan was at work, but never with such venom and barely controlled rage. "I mean it, Charlotte," Victoria continued, her grip tightening until Charlotte winced with pain. "One word to Jonathan about what you think you saw, and I'll convince him that you're becoming just as unstable as your mother was before she died. He's already worried about your behavioral problems at school and those nightmares you've been having." The mention of her mother's supposed instability hit Charlotte like a physical blow to her small chest. Victoria often made subtle comments about her biological mother's mental state, carefully planted implications that mental illness ran in the family, and that Charlotte might be showing early signs of the same problems. Charlotte was too young to understand the psychological manipulation, but old enough to fear the implications. "Your mother used to make up stories too," Victoria whispered, her voice taking on a false, sympathetic tone that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. She would tell people that she saw things that weren't there, that people were plotting against her. Sound familiar? Jonathan's already mentioned how you've been acting out lately, telling impossible stories about things that couldn't possibly be true. "I won't tell anybody," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible as tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I promise I won't say anything to Daddy or anyone else." Victoria studied the child's face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to believe her promise. Finally, she released her grip and smoothed down her expensive blouse, her mask of perfection sliding back into place like a well-rehearsed performance. "Good girl," she said, her voice returning to its normal cold politeness. "Now run along and play with your toys. And remember, children who make up stories about their parents often find themselves in very unpleasant situations far away from home. Boarding schools can be very lonely places for little girls who don't know how to keep their mouths shut." Charlotte fled the study as fast as her small legs could carry her, her bare feet slapping against the marble floors as she raced toward the safety of her bedroom. Once inside, she locked the door and collapsed onto her pink comforter, Mr. Buttons pressed tightly against her chest as tears finally began to flow freely. But even as she cried, Charlotte's young mind was working with the clarity that only comes to children in crisis. She had seen something important in Daddy's study, something that made Victoria angry and secretive and more threatening than usual. The little girl didn't fully understand what it meant, but she knew with the certainty that only children possess that Victoria was doing something very, very wrong. She thought about the hidden place behind the painting, the way Victoria had known exactly where to find it, and the satisfied expression on her stepmother's face when she found what she was looking for. Charlotte might be only 8 years old, but she wasn't stupid. Victoria was stealing something from Daddy, something important enough to threaten a child over. As the afternoon sun began to fade outside her bedroom windows, Charlotte made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find out what Victoria was hiding, even if it meant risking everything she had left. Her daddy deserved to know the truth, even if Charlotte had to be braver than she had ever imagined possible. The 8-year-old wiped her tears and began to plan, her innocent heart filled with a determination that would soon shake the very foundations of the Madison family forever. She didn't know it yet, but her courage was about to uncover secrets that went far deeper than simple theft. Secrets that would reveal the true nature of the woman who had been terrorizing her for 3 long years. 3 long days passed before Charlotte gathered the courage to venture near her father's study again. Victoria had been unusually sweet during dinner conversations, laughing at Jonathan's work stories with practiced charm and asking Charlotte about school with fake interest that made the little girl's skin crawl. The performance was flawless, but Charlotte could see the calculation behind her stepmother's green eyes. During those 3 days, Charlotte had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victoria's face twisted with rage, heard the threats about boarding school and her mother's supposed mental illness. But worse than the fear was the growing certainty that Victoria was hurting Daddy in ways he didn't understand, stealing from him while he worked long hours to provide for their family. "Daddy," Charlotte had whispered during their bedtime routine the night before, her small arms wrapped around his neck as he tucked the covers around her tiny frame. "Can I tell you something really important?" Jonathan's tired eyes had softened, as they always did when he looked at his daughter. Despite the stress of running a billion-dollar company, despite the exhaustion that came with international business deals and hostile takeovers, he always had infinite patience for Charlotte's bedtime conversations. "Of course, sweetheart," he had said gently, sitting on the edge of her bed and stroking her dark hair. "You can tell Daddy anything. You know that, right? No matter what it is, no matter how scared you are, you can always come to me." But when Charlotte opened her mouth to speak about Victoria and the secret hiding place behind the painting, the words wouldn't come. Victoria's threats echoed in her mind like a broken record, mixing with fears of boarding school and losing the only parent she had left. Her stepmother's voice whispered warnings about what happened to little girls who told lies about their families. Instead of revealing the truth, Charlotte had simply asked for an extra bedtime story, disappointing herself with her cowardice, but unable to overcome the fear that had been carefully cultivated over 3 years of psychological manipulation. Now, as Charlotte pressed her ear against the cold wood of the study door, she could hear Victoria inside again, moving around with the confident efficiency of someone who believed she was completely safe from discovery. The little girl's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she listened to the familiar sounds of papers shuffling and that strange clicking noise she had heard before. Charlotte clutched her father's old iPhone, the one he had given her to play educational games when he was busy with important work calls. Her small fingers trembled as she practiced holding it steady, remembering how Daddy had shown her to take pictures of flowers in the garden. The phone felt heavy in her tiny hands, but she was determined to use it to protect her family. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, Charlotte slowly turned the doorknob, grateful that Victoria's arrogance meant she never bothered to lock the door during her secret activities. The study was dimly lit, with only the antique desk lamp casting a warm golden glow across the room's expensive furnishings. Victoria stood with her back to the door, completely absorbed in whatever she was doing behind the large painting. Charlotte could see her stepmother's reflection in the tall windows, her face twisted with concentration and unmistakable greed as she worked. The sight sent a chill down Charlotte's spine, confirming her worst suspicions about the woman who had inserted herself into their family. Moving with the natural stealth that only children seem to possess, Charlotte crept closer to get a better view, the iPhone held ready in her small hands. She had practiced taking pictures of Mr. Buttons earlier that morning, learning how to hold the phone steady and tap the camera button without making any noise that might give her away. Victoria was speaking in a low, urgent voice, and Charlotte realized with growing alarm that her stepmother was on the phone with someone. The conversation was clearly not meant for innocent ears, and every word made Charlotte's stomach twist with anxiety and confusion. "Yes, I have access to everything now," Victoria was saying, her voice filled with barely contained excitement. "The trust fund documents, the will, even the offshore accounts that he thinks are so well hidden. Jonathan has no idea how much he's actually worth, or how easy it's been to document everything." Charlotte's young mind didn't understand all the complicated financial terms, but she recognized the tone, the same excited whisper Victoria used when she thought she was getting away with something particularly clever. The little girl raised the phone with shaking hands, trying to get both Victoria and the open safe in the same picture. "The kid suspects something, but she's too scared to say anything meaningful," Victoria continued, her laugh cold and calculating as she rifled through what appeared to be important documents. "I've made sure of that over the past 3 years. Besides, who would believe an 8-year-old over a grieving stepmother who's been nothing but devoted?" The words hit Charlotte like a slap across her small face, but she forced herself to stay focused on her mission. Through the phone's camera screen, she could see Victoria pulling out thick folders and photographing documents with her own phone, clearly documenting financial information that she had no right to access. "Jonathan thinks I'm helping him raise his troubled daughter," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with contempt. "He has no idea that every behavioral problem, every nightmare, every tear has been carefully orchestrated. The poor man actually feels grateful for my patience with such a difficult child." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as the full scope of Victoria's manipulation became clear. All those times she had been punished for things she didn't do, all those stories about her mother's mental illness, all those threats about boarding school. It had all been part of a deliberate plan to isolate her from her father. "The best part is, he actually trusts me with everything important," Victoria said, her voice filled with triumphant satisfaction. "The fool thinks I married him for love, that I want to build a life with him and his brat. Once I have enough evidence of his hidden assets, I'll file for divorce and take half of everything. The kid will probably end up in foster care where she belongs." Charlotte's small finger hovered over the camera button, waiting for the perfect moment when Victoria's face would be clearly visible, along with the evidence of her theft. Tears threatened to blur her vision, but she blinked them away, determined to get the proof her father needed to see the truth. The perfect shot presented itself as Victoria turned slightly to photograph another document. Charlotte could see her stepmother's face in profile, her phone pointed at open files, the safe clearly visible in the background, her expression twisted with greed and malice. Charlotte pressed the camera button. The flash went off like a lightning bolt in the dimly lit room. Charlotte's heart stopped as Victoria spun around with inhuman speed, her green eyes wide with shock and fury. For what felt like an eternity, both stepmother and stepdaughter stared at each other in stunned silence, the iPhone still clutched in Charlotte's trembling hands like evidence of her crime. "You little spy," Victoria shrieked, her carefully maintained composure shattering completely as she lunged toward the frightened child. "Give me that phone right now, you miserable little brat." Charlotte turned and ran with every ounce of speed her small legs could muster, her bare feet slapping against the marble floors as Victoria's expensive high heels clicked frantically behind her. The little girl's fingers fumbled desperately with the phone, trying to remember how Daddy had shown her to send pictures to his work phone. "Charlotte, get back here this instant!" Victoria's voice echoed through the house, filled with a rage that made the 8-year-old's blood run cold. "You have no idea what you've just done, you stupid child." Charlotte burst through the front door and into the safety of the garden, her small chest heaving as she dove behind the old oak tree where she often played tea party with Mr. Buttons. With shaking fingers that seemed too small and clumsy for such an important task, she managed to find her father's contact information and hit the send button, praying that the picture would reach him in time. Victoria appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel, her perfect hair disheveled and her expensive designer dress wrinkled from the chase. Her eyes scanned the garden with predatory intensity, and Charlotte pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the massive tree trunk, holding her breath. "I know you're out there, you little brat," Victoria called out, her voice taking on the deceptively sweet tone she used whenever she wanted to lure Charlotte into a false sense of security. "Come inside right now, and we can talk about this like civilized people. I'm sure we can work something out that benefits everyone." But Charlotte had heard that particular tone before. It was the same voice Victoria used right before delivering her cruelest punishments, the same false sweetness that preceded threats about boarding school and motherless children who needed to learn their place. The little girl clutched the phone tighter, watching as the message status changed to delivered next to her father's name. Minutes felt like hours as Charlotte waited in her hiding place, her small body shivering despite the warm afternoon air. She could see Victoria pacing back and forth on the front porch like a caged predator, occasionally calling out threats disguised as promises of forgiveness and understanding. "Charlotte, sweetheart, I know you're scared," Victoria continued, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "But you've misunderstood what you saw. Come inside and let me explain everything. Your father will be so disappointed if he finds out you've been spying on family business." Then, like an answer to 3 years of desperate prayers, Charlotte heard the familiar sound of her father's car pulling into the circular driveway with unusual speed. Jonathan's black Mercedes came to an abrupt stop, and Charlotte watched as her daddy emerged with the iPhone clutched in his hand, his face darker and more serious than she had ever seen it. Victoria's demeanor changed instantly, her mask of concerned stepmother sliding back into place as she smoothed her hair and adjusted her dress. But Charlotte could see the panic in her stepmother's eyes, the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully laid plans had just crumbled into dust. "Jonathan, darling, you're home early," Victoria called out, her voice bright with false cheer and relief. "Charlotte's been acting up again, I'm afraid. She was in your study, going through your personal things and taking pictures. I think we need to have a serious talk about boundaries and appropriate behavior." But Jonathan wasn't looking at Victoria with his usual tired affection. His eyes were scanning the garden with urgent intensity, searching for his daughter with a desperation that made Charlotte's heart leap with hope. When their eyes met across the yard, she saw something in his expression that she hadn't seen in 3 long years, complete and total belief in her words, in her. "Charlotte," he called softly, his voice carrying all the love and protection she had been desperate to hear. "Come here, sweetheart. Daddy's here now, and everything's going to be okay." As Charlotte emerged from her hiding place and ran toward her father's outstretched arms, she saw Victoria's face transform one final time. The mask was gone completely now, replaced by the cold, calculating expression of someone who knew their game was finally over. Jonathan's strong arms wrapped around Charlotte's small frame as she collapsed against his chest, her entire body shaking with relief and residual fear. The iPhone fell from her tiny hands onto the manicured grass as she buried her face in his expensive suit jacket, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the stress of his workday and the urgency of his early departure from the office. "Shh, sweetheart, Daddy's here now," Jonathan murmured, his voice gentle and soothing, but his eyes remaining fixed on Victoria, with an intensity that made his wife take an involuntary step backward toward the house. "You did exactly the right thing, Charlotte. You were so brave, and I'm so proud of you." Victoria's carefully constructed facade began to crack like expensive porcelain as she watched the reunion between father and daughter. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her designer dress, her mind racing to find an explanation that might salvage the situation she had worked 3 years to create. "Jonathan, you have to understand," Victoria began, her voice taking on the pleading tone she had perfected over their marriage whenever she needed to manipulate him into seeing things her way. "The child has been having behavioral issues lately, more serious than we've discussed. Dr. Harrison even mentioned that children her age often create elaborate fantasies to deal with unresolved trauma." Charlotte pulled back from her father's protective embrace, her brown eyes wide with indignation that someone would dare call her truth a fantasy. "I'm not making it up, Daddy." She was in your special place behind Grandma's painting, taking pictures of your important papers with her phone. She was talking to someone about taking your money. That's exactly what I mean, Jonathan. Victoria interjected quickly, seizing on Charlotte's passionate defense as evidence of instability. She's been obsessing over your study for weeks now, creating these elaborate scenarios about me doing things that make no sense. I've caught her trying to get in there multiple times when you're at work. But Jonathan was studying the photograph on his phone with the laser focus of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire through attention to detail and an ability to spot deception from miles away. Charlotte watched as her father's jaw tightened, his free hand clenching into a fist as he absorbed every detail of what his daughter had so courageously captured. The image was crystal clear. Victoria standing before the open safe, her own phone in hand as she photographed confidential documents, her face twisted with greed and satisfaction. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation, no way to explain away what the picture so clearly documented. This photograph shows you accessing my personal safe, Victoria, Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that Charlotte had heard him use during the most tense business phone calls. A safe that only I have the combination to, hidden behind a painting that even my closest business associates don't know exists. Victoria's face went pale beneath her expensive makeup, but she quickly rallied with the desperation of someone fighting for their life. I was looking for Charlotte's birth certificate and other important family documents. You mentioned needing them for her school registration, and I thought I could help by finding them myself while you were busy at work. The birth certificate is in the filing cabinet in my office downtown, Jonathan replied, his voice growing colder with each carefully measured word. It's never been in the home safe, along with any other documents related to Charlotte's schooling. And even if it were, you've never shown any interest in helping with Charlotte's educational matters before today. Charlotte felt a surge of pride as she watched her father systematically dismantle Victoria's lies with the precision of a surgeon. This was the daddy she remembered from before Victoria had entered their lives, sharp, protective, analytical, and impossible to fool with half-truths and manipulation. Jonathan, please, Victoria tried again, tears beginning to form in her green eyes as she realized her usual tactics weren't working. I know this looks bad from a certain perspective, but you have to trust me. I love you. I love our family. Everything I do is for us, for our future together. Our family? Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 years of suppressed suspicions and growing doubts. Is that what you call constantly threatening to send my daughter away to boarding school? Making her feel unwelcome and unsafe in her own home? Terrorizing an 8-year-old child with threats about her dead mother's mental health? Victoria's mask slipped completely as desperation replaced her usual calculated charm. She's not even grateful for everything we've given her. Do you have any idea how hard it is to be a stepmother to a child who resents your very existence? Who looks at you like you're some kind of monster every time you try to provide guidance and structure? I don't resent you, Charlotte said quietly, her small voice cutting through the adult tension like a knife through silk. The simple honesty of her words carried more weight than any accusation could have managed. I just wanted you to love me like you love Daddy. I wanted us to be a real family. The statement seemed to deflate Victoria's remaining fight, but not in the way Charlotte had hoped. Instead of showing remorse or understanding, Victoria's expression hardened into something cold and bitter. Love you? She laughed, the sound harsh and unnatural. You're not even his real daughter, you know that? You're just a reminder of his dead wife, a burden he's too sentimental to get rid of. I've been doing you both a favor by trying to teach you some reality. Jonathan's control finally snapped. He stood and turned to face Victoria with an expression that made her stumble backward toward the house, suddenly aware that she had pushed too far. Get out, he said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout could have managed. Jonathan, please, we can work this out, Victoria pleaded, her perfect composure completely shattered as she realized the full scope of her mistake. I made some errors in judgment, but we can go to counseling. We can figure out how to blend our family better. We can... Get out, Jonathan roared, his voice echoing across the garden and causing Victoria to flinch as if she had been physically struck. Get out of my house, away from my daughter, and out of our lives now. Victoria's face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, anger, calculation, and finally, cold acceptance of her defeat. When she spoke again, her voice had returned to its familiar, cruel edge, all pretense of love and concern abandoned. "You'll regret this decision, Jonathan," she said, her words dripping with venom. "I know things about your business dealings that could destroy you and your precious company. I have copies of documents that would interest the SEC very much, financial records that—" "No, you don't," Jonathan interrupted, pulling out his own phone with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because while you were busy terrorizing my daughter and planning your little heist, I was having my security team monitor all electronic access to my files. Every document you photographed, every file you copied, every conversation you thought was private, I have complete records of all of it." The color drained completely from Victoria's face as the full scope of her situation became clear. She had been outmaneuvered by the same man she had been trying to manipulate and steal from for 3 years. 20 minutes, Jonathan continued, his voice returning to its deadly calm. "You have exactly 20 minutes to pack whatever personal items you brought into this house and leave. My security team is already on their way, and if you ever come near my daughter again, I'll have you arrested for child endangerment, theft, and attempted fraud." As Victoria turned and walked toward the house with whatever dignity she could muster, Charlotte felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. The nightmare that had defined her life for 3 years was finally over. "Daddy?" she whispered, tugging on his sleeve with small fingers. "Are you really not going to send me to boarding school, even if I'm sometimes difficult?" Jonathan knelt down again and pulled his daughter into the fiercest, most protective hug of her young life. "Never, sweetheart. Never. You're the most important thing in my world, and I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening sooner. You should never have had to be this brave." Charlotte buried her face in her father's shoulder, finally allowing herself to cry tears of relief instead of fear. For the first time in 3 years, she felt truly safe and loved and protected. But neither father nor daughter could have imagined the revelation that Victoria's investigation would soon uncover. A truth about Charlotte's real mother and her connection to Victoria that would shake the very foundation of everything they thought they knew about their family. The real story, with all its shocking twists and hidden connections, was just beginning to unfold. 2 weeks after Victoria's dramatic departure from the Madison estate, life began to feel normal for the first time in Charlotte's young memory. The house felt lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had been lifted from its elegant rooms. Charlotte could run through the hallways without fear, play in the garden without looking over her shoulder, and most importantly, she could talk to her daddy about anything without worrying about punishment or threats. Jonathan had taken a leave of absence from his company to spend time with Charlotte, something he had never done before in her 8 years of life. They spent their mornings having breakfast together in the sunlit kitchen, their afternoons exploring the garden and playing games, and their evenings reading stories that Charlotte got to choose herself. "Daddy," Charlotte said one morning as they sat at the kitchen table sharing pancakes shaped like butterflies, "why did Victoria hate me so much? Was it really because I reminded you of Mommy?" Jonathan set down his coffee cup and studied his daughter's innocent face, still struggling with how much truth an 8-year-old could handle. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people do bad things because they're hurt inside, or because they want something they can't have. Victoria wanted our family's money more than she wanted to be part of our family." Charlotte nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation the way children do when they trust the adult speaking to them. But Jonathan could see questions still lingering in her dark eyes, the same eyes that had belonged to her mother. The tranquil morning was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell, followed by urgent knocking. Jonathan frowned, checking his watch. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his security team usually announced visitors well in advance. "Stay here, sweetheart," he told Charlotte, rising from the table. "Finish your breakfast while I see who that is." Jonathan opened the front door to find Detective Sarah Chen from the Connecticut State Police, a woman he recognized from various charity events but had never spoken to personally. She was accompanied by a younger officer whose serious expression suggested this wasn't a social call. "Mr. Madison," Detective Chen said, her voice professional but tinged with urgency. I'm sorry to disturb you at home, but we need to discuss some information that's come to light regarding Victoria Madison during our fraud investigation. Of course, Jonathan replied, though something in the detective's tone made his blood run cold. What have you discovered? Detective Chen exchanged a meaningful look with her partner. Sir, this involves some very sensitive information about your daughter and your late wife. Is there somewhere private we can talk? Jonathan glanced back toward the kitchen where Charlotte was happily cutting her butterfly pancakes into smaller pieces, blissfully unaware that her world was about to shift again. Let me get Charlotte settled with a movie upstairs first, Jonathan said quietly. This sounds like a conversation that requires privacy. 10 minutes later, with Charlotte safely ensconced in her bedroom watching her favorite Disney film, Jonathan led the officers into his study. The room still felt violated after Victoria's intrusion, but it remained the most private space in the house. Mr. Madison, Detective Chen began, pulling out a thick file folder. When we arrested Victoria Madison for the fraud charges, we discovered something troubling. The woman you knew as Victoria Madison isn't who she claimed to be. Jonathan felt his world tilt slightly. What do you mean? The detective opened her file and pulled out several photographs and documents. Her real name is Rebecca Hartwell. According to our investigation, she specifically targeted you and your family. This wasn't a chance meeting or a romantic relationship gone wrong. This was a calculated long-term plan. Jonathan stared at the document showing Victoria's real identity. But how? Why would she target us? Mr. Madison, Rebecca Hartwell spent 2 years researching your family before she ever approached you at that charity gala, Detective Chen continued. She knew about your wife's death, your daughter, your business holdings, and most importantly, she knew a secret about Charlotte's parentage. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Charlotte's parentage? What are you talking about? Detective Chen leaned forward, her expression grave. According to documents we found in Rebecca's apartment, along with original birth records she had obtained illegally, Charlotte isn't your biological daughter. Your late wife Margaret was pregnant when she met you, and the biological father is listed as unknown on the original birth certificate. Jonathan sank into his desk chair, his mind reeling. That's impossible, Margaret never said. I've been Charlotte's father since she was born. You are legally Charlotte's father in every way that matters, Detective Chen assured him quickly. The adoption you completed when you married Margaret is completely valid. But Rebecca knew this information, and she was planning to use it against you. How? Jonathan whispered, though he was beginning to understand the scope of Victoria's manipulation. She was building a case to claim that you were an unfit guardian, the younger officer explained. All those stories about Charlotte being difficult, the behavioral problems, the threats about boarding school. She was documenting everything to present to family court as evidence that Charlotte needed to be removed from your care. Jonathan thought about all the times Victoria had undermined his relationship with Charlotte, all the subtle ways she had made him doubt his parenting skills. But she's not even related to Charlotte. What standing would she have in court? Detective Chen pulled out another document. That's where this gets more complicated. Rebecca Hartwell was married to Charlotte's biological father, a man named David Hartwell. He died in a motorcycle accident when Charlotte was 6 months old, but not before Rebecca discovered he had been having an affair with a married woman who had just given birth. The implications hit Jonathan like a sledgehammer. Margaret was having an affair? According to the evidence we've found, your wife had a brief relationship with David Hartwell shortly before she met you. Detective Chen confirmed gently. When she discovered she was pregnant, she chose to start fresh with you and list you as Charlotte's father on the amended birth certificate. Jonathan felt betrayed and heartbroken, but also strangely protective of Margaret's memory. She had been young, frightened, and alone when she made those choices. So Rebecca came after us because she wanted revenge against the woman who had destroyed her marriage, and when Margaret died, she transferred that hatred to you and Charlotte, Detective Chen explained. But more than that, she wanted access to the wealth and lifestyle that she felt Margaret had stolen from her. The detective pulled out surveillance photos showing Victoria Rebecca watching their house, following Charlotte to school, and meeting with lawyers. She spent those 2 years learning everything about your family, your routines, your vulnerabilities. The chance meeting at the charity gala was anything but chance. Jonathan studied the evidence, feeling sick as he realized how completely they had been manipulated. What was her endgame? Financial gain and psychological revenge, Detective Chen replied. She planned to marry you, document Charlotte's behavioral problems that she was creating, then file for divorce and custody simultaneously. As the widow of Charlotte's biological father, she would claim that Charlotte belonged with her, especially given the evidence of your inadequate parenting. And she would have won? Jonathan asked, his voice hollow. Possibly, Detective Chen admitted. Family courts often favor blood relatives, especially when there's documentation of problems in the current home. Rebecca was very thorough in her planning. Jonathan thought about Charlotte upstairs, innocent and trusting, completely unaware that a stranger had spent years plotting to destroy her family. Does Charlotte need to know any of this? We strongly recommend against telling her, Detective Chen said firmly. She suffered enough trauma, and learning that her biological mother had an affair or that her stepmother was plotting to take her away would be devastating. What matters is that Rebecca is now in prison and can never hurt your family again. What are the charges against her? Identity theft, fraud, conspiracy, child endangerment, and stalking, the officer listed. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in prison. But Mr. Madison, there's one more thing you should know. Jonathan braced himself for another revelation. What? Rebecca made some statements about your wife's car accident, suggesting she had been in contact with Margaret before her death. Detective Chen said carefully. We're reopening that investigation to determine if there was any foul play involved. Jonathan's blood froze. The idea that Margaret might have been murdered was almost too much to process on top of everything else. Do you think Rebecca? We're investigating all possibilities, Detective Chen replied diplomatically. We'll keep you informed as the investigation progresses. After the officers left, Jonathan sat alone in his study for a long time, trying to process the bombshell that had just exploded his understanding of everything. Charlotte wasn't his biological daughter. Margaret had kept enormous secrets from him, and the woman who had terrorized them both for 3 years was actually a calculating predator who had targeted their family specifically. But as he sat there, surrounded by the silence of his enormous house, Jonathan realized that the most important truth remained unchanged. Charlotte was upstairs, safe and happy, probably wondering why Daddy was taking so long to come watch the movie with her. She was his daughter in every way that counted, blood or no blood, secrets or no secrets. The revelation about Charlotte's parentage was shocking but irrelevant to their relationship. He had loved her from the moment Margaret placed her in his arms, and nothing would ever change that. The legal adoption was solid, Rebecca was in prison, and Charlotte was safe. Jonathan climbed the stairs to Charlotte's room, ready to watch Disney movies and eat popcorn and pretend that the world was simple again. At least for Charlotte, it would remain simple. She would never need to know the complicated truth about her origins or the evil woman who had tried to destroy their family. As he opened Charlotte's bedroom door and saw her bright smile when she spotted him, Jonathan made a silent promise. Whatever secrets the past held, whatever truths might yet be revealed, Charlotte would grow up knowing only love and security. That was all that mattered now. 3 months had passed since the devastating revelations about Victoria's true identity, and Jonathan had managed to create a bubble of normalcy around Charlotte that protected her from the chaos swirling around their family. The little girl had returned to school, made new friends, and slowly began to trust that the adults in her life would keep her safe. But Jonathan's carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered again. Detective Chen called on a rainy Thursday morning while Charlotte was at school, her voice heavy with the weight of new discoveries. Mr. Madison, we need you to come to the station. We've made significant progress in the investigation into your wife's death, and there are some things you need to see. Jonathan's hands trembled as he hung up the phone. For 3 months, he had pushed thoughts of the reopened investigation to the back of his mind, focusing entirely on Charlotte's well-being. But now the truth was demanding his attention. The police station felt cold and sterile as Jonathan followed Detective Chen to a small conference room filled with photographs, documents, and evidence boxes. The sight of Margaret's car accident photos spread across the table made his knees weak. "Mr. Madison, please sit down," Detective Chen said gently. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear, but it will finally give you the complete truth about what happened to your family." Jonathan lowered himself into a plastic chair, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Margaret's crumpled car at the bottom of a ravine. "Just tell me. I need to know what happened to my wife." Detective Chen opened a thick file and pulled out several documents. "We've been investigating Rebecca Hartwell's background extensively, and what we found reveals a much more sinister picture than we initially thought. Rebecca didn't just target your family randomly. She had a personal vendetta that goes back years. She placed a series of photographs on the table, surveillance images and phone records that painted a disturbing picture. Rebecca had been tracking Margaret's movements for months before the accident, but not because she was planning to approach your family. She was planning something much worse." Jonathan studied the evidence, his heart sinking as he began to understand the implications. "What are you saying?" "We believe Rebecca Hartwell murdered your wife," Detective Chen said quietly. "And the motive was deeply personal." The detective pulled out a series of documents that made Jonathan's world tilt on its axis. "We discovered that Rebecca's late husband, David Hartwell, wasn't just Charlotte's biological father. He was also Margaret's college boyfriend, someone she had been in love with long before she met you." Jonathan felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Margaret knew Charlotte's father before she was pregnant? "They had been together for 2 years in college," Detective Chen explained. "David broke up with Margaret to marry Rebecca, who came from a wealthy family. But Margaret discovered she was pregnant shortly after the breakup. She tried to contact David, but Rebecca intercepted all communication and convinced David that Margaret was lying about the pregnancy to break up his marriage." The detective placed phone records on the table. "Margaret spent Charlotte's first year trying to reach David, to let him know he had a daughter. She finally succeeded in contacting him directly when Charlotte was 18 months old." Jonathan's hands shook as he processed this information. "What happened then?" "David was devastated to learn he had a daughter he'd never met," Detective Chen continued. "He demanded a divorce from Rebecca so he could be in Charlotte's life. Rebecca fought the divorce viciously, but David was determined. The final divorce papers were signed 1 week before David died in his motorcycle accident." "And you think Rebecca—" "We know Rebecca caused David's accident," Detective Chen said firmly. "We found evidence that she tampered with his motorcycle the night before he died. David was planning to meet Margaret and Charlotte for the first time the next day." Jonathan felt sick as the scope of Rebecca's evil became clear. "So she killed her own husband?" "David had changed his will to include Charlotte as his heir," Detective Chen explained. "Rebecca would have lost everything in the divorce. By killing David, she inherited his entire estate and prevented him from legitimizing Charlotte, or providing for her financially." The detective pulled out another set of documents. "But Margaret had kept all of David's letters, photos, and legal documents proving Charlotte's parentage. She was building a case to claim David's inheritance on Charlotte's behalf even though he was dead. That's why Rebecca killed Margaret too?" "Rebecca discovered that Margaret was working with lawyers to prove Charlotte's claim to David's estate," Detective Chen confirmed. 3 years ago, Margaret contacted Rebecca directly, offering to share the inheritance in exchange for Rebecca acknowledging Charlotte as David's daughter. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he understood Margaret's fatal mistake. She trusted Rebecca. Margaret thought she was doing the right thing, giving Charlotte a connection to her biological father's family and securing her financial future, Detective Chen said sadly. She had no idea that Rebecca had already murdered David to prevent exactly this scenario. The detective placed the final piece of evidence on the table, phone records showing multiple calls between Margaret and Rebecca in the weeks before the accident. Rebecca agreed to meet with Margaret to discuss the inheritance, but she was planning to kill her from the beginning. The car accident wasn't random. Rebecca sabotaged Margaret's brakes during what Margaret thought was a friendly lunch meeting. Jonathan stared at the evidence, overwhelmed by the layers of betrayal and murder that had shaped his family's history. "So Rebecca spent 3 years planning to finish what she started?" "Exactly," Detective Chen replied. "She married you to gain access to Charlotte and to the legal documents Margaret had hidden. She was searching for proof of Charlotte's parentage so she could destroy it permanently. If she could eliminate all evidence of David being Charlotte's father, she would keep his entire inheritance while also gaining access to yours through marriage. But Charlotte's DNA would still prove the connection, Jonathan pointed out. Rebecca was planning to have Charlotte declared mentally unstable and institutionalized, Detective Chen revealed. She had been documenting behavioral problems and planned to claim that Charlotte was genetically predisposed to mental illness from Margaret's side of the family. Once Charlotte was committed, Rebecca would have been her legal guardian and could have prevented any DNA testing. The evil brilliance of the plan made Jonathan feel physically ill. She would have destroyed Charlotte's entire life. Rebecca Hartwell is a sociopath who has spent the last 6 years systematically murdering anyone who threatened her financial security, Detective Chen said bluntly. If Charlotte hadn't been brave enough to photograph her crimes, Rebecca might have succeeded completely. Jonathan thought about his innocent daughter, who had no idea that a serial killer had been living in their house for 3 years, planning her destruction. What happens now? Rebecca has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, in addition to the fraud charges, Detective Chen explained. She's going to spend the rest of her life in prison. And Mr. Madison, there's something else you should know. She pulled out one final document that made Jonathan's heart race. David Hartwell's estate was worth over $30 million when he died. As his only child, Charlotte is entitled to inherit everything once we've proven her parentage in court. Jonathan stared at the inheritance documents, realizing that Charlotte was not only safe from Rebecca forever, but was also financially secure for life, thanks to the biological father she would never meet. Does Charlotte need to know about any of this? He asked. We recommend keeping the details private until she's much older, Detective Chen said. She knows you're her father in every way that matters. The inheritance can be managed through a trust fund until she comes of age, and she never needs to know about the murders or Rebecca's true identity. As Jonathan drove home to pick up Charlotte from school, his mind reeled with all the secrets and lies that had shaped their family. But as he pulled into the school parking lot and saw his daughter's bright smile when she spotted his car, none of the complicated history mattered. Charlotte ran toward him with her backpack bouncing, her face glowing with the simple joy of seeing her daddy after a long day at school. She climbed into the car and immediately began chattering about her art project and the new friend she had made at lunch. Daddy, guess what? Mrs. Johnson said my painting of our house was the best in the class, Charlotte announced proudly. She wants to hang it in the hallway for everyone to see. Jonathan smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm, making a silent promise to himself that she would never learn the dark truth about her origins. Charlotte would grow up knowing only love and security, protected from the sins of adults who had made terrible choices before she was even old enough to understand. That's wonderful, sweetheart, he said, reaching over to squeeze her small hand. I'm so proud of you. As they drove home together, Charlotte babbling happily about her day, Jonathan realized that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give their child is the strength to carry the painful truths alone. Charlotte was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she felt loved and protected. The secrets would remain buried, but their love would continue to grow. And Charlotte's biological father's inheritance would ensure that she would always be financially secure, even though she would never know where that security came from. Justice had been served, evil had been punished, and innocence had been preserved. That was enough. 6 months after Victoria's arrest and the revelation of the Madison family's hidden truths, Charlotte celebrated her 9th birthday in the garden where she had once hidden in fear. The party was small but perfect, just Charlotte, Jonathan, and a few of her closest friends from school, laughing and playing games under the same oak tree that had once been her refuge. The transformation in both father and daughter over the past months had been remarkable. Jonathan had restructured his entire life around Charlotte's needs, delegating more responsibilities at work, and creating a schedule that prioritized family time above corporate meetings. Charlotte, meanwhile, had blossomed from a fearful, anxious child into a confident young girl who spoke up in class, made friends easily, and no longer flinched when adults raised their voices. Jonathan watched his daughter blow out 9 candles on her cake. her face glowing with pure happiness as she made a wish that he hoped with all his heart would come true. She had grown so much in the past months, gaining confidence and security that had been impossible when Victoria's shadow loomed over their lives. Her smile was genuine now, reaching her eyes in a way that broke and healed Jonathan's heart simultaneously. "What did you wish for, sweetheart?" Jonathan asked as Charlotte carefully removed the candles from her chocolate cake, a homemade creation they had spent the morning decorating together with rainbow sprinkles and her favorite candy flowers. "I can't tell you, Daddy, or it won't come true," Charlotte said with the serious expression she wore whenever discussing important magical rules. "But it's something really good for both of us, and it's about our family staying happy forever." The party had been everything Charlotte had dreamed of. Games of hide-and-seek through the garden where she once hid in terror, a treasure hunt that led to small gifts hidden throughout the estate, and the kind of carefree laughter that had been absent from the Madison house for far too long. Her friends from school had marveled at the beautiful grounds and the indoor swimming pool, but most importantly, they had seen Charlotte in her element, confident and joyful in her own home. After the party ended and Charlotte's friends had been picked up by their parents, father and daughter sat together on the porch swing that Jonathan had installed specifically for moments like this. They watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had decorated Charlotte's birthday cake. "Daddy," Charlotte said quietly, her small hand slipping into his much larger one with the comfortable familiarity of a ritual they had developed over the months of healing. "Do you ever miss Victoria?" The question caught Jonathan off guard. In the months since Victoria's departure, Charlotte had rarely mentioned her former stepmother, and Jonathan had assumed she was simply glad to be free of the woman who had terrorized her for 3 crucial years of her young life. "Do you miss her, sweetheart?" he asked carefully, wanting to understand what his daughter was feeling without influencing her answer. These conversations had taught him the importance of letting Charlotte explore her emotions without judgment. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her legs swinging gently as she considered her answer with the thoughtfulness that had replaced her former anxiety. "Sometimes I miss the idea of having a mommy," she said finally, her voice carrying a maturity that both impressed and saddened Jonathan. "But I don't miss being scared all the time. I don't miss worrying that you might send me away or that I wasn't good enough to be part of our family." Jonathan's heart ached for the little girl who had spent 3 crucial years of her childhood living in constant fear of abandonment. The therapy sessions they had attended together had helped him understand just how deeply Victoria's psychological manipulation had affected Charlotte's sense of security and self-worth. "Charlotte, I want you to know something very important," he said, turning to face her fully so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "No matter what happens in our lives, no matter what anyone tells you, no matter what challenges we face, you are my daughter and I will never, ever send you away. You are the most important thing in my world, and that will never change." "I know that now," Charlotte said, snuggling closer to her father's side with the trust that had taken months to rebuild. "But I didn't know it before. Victoria made me think you didn't really want me, that I was just a burden you had to take care of because of Mommy." The simple statement cut Jonathan deeper than any business failure or financial loss ever could. The idea that his beloved daughter had spent years doubting his love because of Victoria's calculated manipulation filled him with a protective fury that still burned bright after all this time. "Charlotte," he said gently, his voice thick with emotion, "what Victoria did to you, the way she made you feel unwanted and scared, that was never about you or anything you did wrong. That was about her being a very troubled person who made terrible choices because she was hurt and angry about things that happened long before you were born. You are wanted, you are loved, and you are exactly where you belong." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Jonathan's phone buzzed with a text message from his lawyer. The trust fund established with Charlotte's biological father's inheritance had been finalized, ensuring her financial security for life. But Jonathan would never tell her about that money or where it came from. Some gifts were better given anonymously. The past months had brought other changes too. Jonathan had established a college fund for Charlotte with his own money, ensuring her education regardless of what happened to his business empire. He had updated his will to make absolutely certain that Charlotte would be protected and provided for. Most importantly, He had learned to be present in her daily life, attending school plays and parent-teacher conferences, helping with homework, and creating traditions that would give Charlotte a sense of stability and belonging. "Daddy," Charlotte said suddenly, interrupting his thoughts, "I think my birthday wish might come true." "Oh, really? And what makes you think that?" Charlotte smiled up at him with the wisdom that sometimes shines from children who have overcome great difficulties and emerged stronger. "Because it was about us being happy together forever, and we already are. We don't need anything else to make our family complete, do we?" Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes as he looked down at this remarkable little girl who had survived so much trauma and emerged with her capacity for love and hope intact. "No, sweetheart. We don't need anything else. We have each other, and that's everything." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jonathan reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The past months had been filled with healing and growth, with Charlotte slowly learning to trust that she was safe and loved unconditionally. She had excelled in school, made wonderful friends who accepted her completely, and most importantly, she had learned to be a child again instead of a frightened victim walking on eggshells. The truth about her biological parentage remained buried in legal documents in Jonathan's memory, a secret he would carry to his grave to protect her innocence. Charlotte knew only that she was his daughter, loved and cherished beyond measure. The complicated web of lies, betrayals, and family secrets that had shaped her origins would never touch her innocent world if he had anything to say about it. "Time for bed, birthday girl," Jonathan said, as Charlotte yawned against his shoulder, the excitement of the day finally catching up with her. "Can we read 2 stories tonight since it's my birthday?" she asked hopefully, looking up at him with the same brown eyes that had once been filled with fear, but now sparkled with security and love. "We can read 3 stories if you want," Jonathan replied, scooping her up in his arms despite the fact that she was getting bigger every day. Charlotte giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck, completely secure in her father's love and protection. As Jonathan carried his daughter upstairs, he marveled at how different their bedtime routine had become. There were no more tears, no more nightmares about being sent away, no more whispered questions about whether Daddy really loved her. Instead, there were giggles and stories and the comfortable intimacy of a father and daughter who trusted each other completely. As Jonathan tucked Charlotte into her bed and read her favorite stories about brave princesses and magical adventures, he marveled at the incredible resilience of children. Charlotte had faced manipulation, psychological abuse, fear and betrayal from the very person who should have protected her, yet she had emerged stronger and more loving than ever. "I love you, Daddy," Charlotte whispered as Jonathan turned off her bedside lamp, leaving only the soft glow of her nightlight to chase away any lingering shadows. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than all the stars in the sky and all the fish in the ocean," he replied, repeating the phrase that had become their special goodnight ritual. "Even more than your work and all your important meetings?" she teased, a question that had once worried her deeply, but now was asked with complete confidence in his answer. "Especially more than my work," Jonathan replied without hesitation. "You are the most important thing in my entire life, and that will never, ever change. You are my greatest achievement, my proudest accomplishment, and my greatest joy." As Charlotte drifted off to sleep with a smile on her face, Jonathan stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching the peaceful expression that had replaced the fear and anxiety that had once haunted her features. She was safe, she was loved, and she was home in every sense that mattered. The Madison family had been built on secrets and lies, but it had survived and thrived because of love, courage, and the determination to protect what mattered most. Charlotte's bravery in exposing Victoria's crimes had saved them both, and Jonathan's commitment to shielding her from painful truths would ensure her happiness for years to come. Walking to his own bedroom, Jonathan paused at the window that overlooked the garden where Charlotte had once hidden behind the oak tree, terrified and alone. Now that same garden was a place of joy and celebration, where birthday parties were held, friends gathered, and dreams came true. The transformation was symbolic of their entire family's journey from darkness into light. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't the revelation of truth, but the preservation of innocence. Charlotte would grow up knowing only love and security, protected by a trust fund she would never know about and shielded from secrets that could only cause her pain. That was exactly as it should be. In the end, the only truth that mattered was the simplest one of all. Jonathan Madison was Charlotte's father, and Charlotte was his beloved daughter. Everything else was just complicated history that would never touch their future again. As he settled into bed, Jonathan smiled to himself, thinking about Charlotte's birthday wish and her profound observation that they were already happy together. She was right. They didn't need anything else to make their family complete. Love had triumphed over deception, courage had conquered fear, and a little girl's bravery had saved them all. The Madison family would face whatever challenges lay ahead together, built on a foundation of genuine love and trust, rather than the lies and manipulation that had once threatened to destroy them. And that, Jonathan knew with absolute certainty, was the happiest ending any father could ask for. Rebecca Hartwell would spend the rest of her life in prison for her crimes, justice had been served, and two innocent people had found their way back to each other. The truth had set them free, even if that truth would remain forever hidden from the child it was meant to protect.